It's the end of isolation, lesson 15.2. What factors motivated Japan's decision to end its isolation? We're going to learn that and more. So stick around and let's learn something. Lesson 15.2. In this lesson, we will learn about the factors that motivated Japan to end isolation. This is the end of isolation. And we need to first realize that Matthew Perry, Commodore Perry, not the actor from TV there, but Commodore Perry's arrival was not the first contact that the Japanese had from the West. The Portuguese and the Dutch came first, and yes, I see that I've got a spelling mistake there on Portuguese, and I will fix that after. But the Portuguese and the Dutch, they came first. But the shogun was able to maintain control using his isolation policy. So the Dutch came for trading purposes, and they were only meant business, and the shogun was able to maintain that and control that. But by the early 1800s, we have the Russians, the British, and the Americans that are beginning to arrive. And Japan was, well, they were using force to remove any of these outside threats that were coming in. But the problem with isolation is some things tend to fall behind, like technology. So at first, yeah, they could keep the Russians, the British, Americans at bay, but eventually they knew that their technology, their military technology would not be able to keep up with the outside world. And that's exactly what's happening. We're getting pressure from the outside. So when the Russians, the British, and the Americans began arriving, yeah, at first it was easy for the Japanese to force them out. But it was in the mid-1800s, in 1853, when the United States came in. And they brought with them their gunboats. And, they were having that intimidating force, show of force there with that military technology. And they were requesting from Japan, they wanted trade, they wanted protection, and they wanted the right to buy coal, for their passing whaling ships. Okay, so these were the things that they wanted. So Perry left, and he let the Japanese kind of think about it for a while. So Perry returned a year later, and that's when they began signing treaties. Of Kanagawa is the first treaty that was signed in 1854. And this treaty was opening of 2 ports in Japan for these whaling ships, establish an American consulate so that they can do eventually business with the Americans and the Japanese, and to purchase coal. In 1858, there were more treaties that were being signed by other countries wanting to come into Japan. And a lot of Japanese were unhappy with these treaties, with the terms of these treaties, and they were called the unequal treaties. They were unequal because it benefited the foreign nations more than it benefited Japan. And Japan lost control of trade. They were no longer in charge of their own trade. So many Japanese viewed this as unequal. Now, we've seen treaties before in other curriculum, like in grade 7 social studies. And you'll learn more about treaties in grade 9 social studies when we talk of our First Nations in Canada. But how did this all happen? Well, this all happened because Perry shows up with a lot of military strength, and they were showing off the power that they had. If these treaties weren't signed, then the Japanese knew that if they went to war with the United States, they would lose. They just could not keep up technologically with Japan. They could not keep up with the military, not with Japan, like with the United States, and they could not keep up with the military of the United States. And they were worried that Japan would turn into China during the Opium Wars, where foreign countries came in, they carved up China, they divided China all over the over the Opium Wars, and the Japanese were scared. So the Japanese felt like, okay, if we sign these treaties, then maybe we will be okay. So those are the threats that were coming from the outside. But we talked about in the last chapter that unrest was happening inside. So during this period of Japanese history, there was also not only pressure from the outside, but there's also pressure from the inside. And the power of the shogun was slowly getting weaker and weaker and weaker as time goes on. So there's three things that we can take a look at and how we're going to respond to these treaties. Okay, so this was stolen right out of your textbook. So we can follow the motto of honor the emperor and expel the barbarians. Okay, this is coming from the idea that Japan is a divine land and that the Japanese are superior to the Westerners. If we follow this motto, then the solution to these unequal treaties would be to go to war against the Westerners, and then the period of Japanese isolation will continue. That's option number one. Option number two comes from the model of Eastern ethics and Western science. So if we follow that model, well, then we adopt as Japanese Western technology, especially that of the military, but we keep Japanese values and morals. Solution there that shows us that the Japanese would adopt some elements of Western civilization. That was number two. Or we can do the third thing, where we don't follow any kind of model as Japanese, and overseas trade is necessary to increase the wealth of Japan. Change is going to happen no matter what. That's the idea behind that. So the solution, if we go through with that idea, is to welcome the Americans and welcome the Europeans and trade with them and see what happens. So those are really the three responses to these unequal treaties. I'm going to pause. Which one do you think you would follow through with? Honor the emperor, expel the barbarians? The Eastern ethics and Western science model? Or have no model at all? Which one do you think would have been the most beneficial for Japan? But those pressures from within, they continue. We have civil war. The response that ended up happening from the shogun showed that the shogun was weak, and the people of Japan were unhappy with it. So they began rioting in the streets. If we look to the daimyo, they were opposed to the shogun. And if they were retired or arrested. Retired. I'm using air quotations for retired. The samurai, they were imprisoned. They were exiled. Maybe they were executed. And at one point, they were able to drive off foreign ships. But now foreign ships began defending themselves and started shooting and bombarding the shores of Japan. So now we're having some problems here. So the shogun finally, in 1868, a year after Canada becomes a country, the shogun resigns and the emperor takes over after a civil war that takes place. So a civil war is fighting amongst yourselves, people in a country fighting amongst themselves. And this is all happening while in this story of Japan, there's another story that's taking place over in the United States, and that's American expansion. The American War of Independence, which happened way before that, caused the United States to expand on its territory. And you can see on the map here, you can see the different times here. We have Ohio and the Illinois, Louisiana Purchase, Oregon country, stuff like that. All these are happening at different times in American history, while everybody else's history is moving forward as well. But eventually, the Americans expand from the Atlantic Ocean on the east coast to the Pacific Ocean on the west coast. And they were fulfilling their manifest destiny. If you remember from previous curriculum back in grade 7, the Americans did have manifest destiny. They wanted to control all of North America. Now that they've hit the Pacific side, now they automatically assumed that crossing the Pacific was the next natural place for them to go. And if you cross the Pacific, well, the next logical place to go is Japan. So Japan's history is moving forward, American history is moving forward, and at one point they are going to cross paths, and that's what happened with Commodore Perry. All right, I want you to head over to your notebooks and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.